Good morning. I'm very happy to be here this morning to introduce the speaker for this talk, Online Privacy, Industry Self-Regulation in Practice. I met Aleecia while we were both undergraduate students at Carnegie Mellon University, and we quickly became friends. She spent a decade working in Silicon Valley before deciding to go back to CMU to pursue a master's in public policy. She's currently a PhD candidate in engineering and public policy at Carnegie Mellon University. Her findings have been featured in media outlets such as The Washington Post, Ars Technica, and Free Press's Media Minute, and have contributed to testimony before the Federal Trade Commission. Please join me in welcoming Aleecia McDonald.
Thank you, Kevin. Kevin has been very patient and tireless in making this happen today. Thank you so much for the opportunity to come and speak to Google. And thank you for all being here today. As Kevin said, my name is Aleecia McDonald. I'm advised by Lori Faith Craner at Carnegie Mellon, and I'll be talking about some research on online privacy today. So just as an overview for today's talk, we'll be first going through a little bit of background on industry self-regulation for online privacy, just so we're all talking about the same thing. And then two different areas of research that come from the Cylab, and that is the cost of reading privacy policies and also a study comparing different formats for online privacy policies. And those are both available in full on the CUPS website at cups.cs.cmu.edu, or you can also find them from my website at aleecia.com. And we'll wrap the whole thing up with a discussion of some public policy options of where we go from here. So first, by way of background, the Fair Information Principles originated in the United States in the 1970s, and these were in response to all sorts of credit databases that were being stored on mainframes. People started to get concerned about the breadth and depth of information being held about them. In the United States, most of our laws, however, are about privacy threats from the government rather than from private industry. So these fair information principles really took hold internationally and then migrated back to the United States. So at this point, they've been adopted by the Federal Trade Commission, and they have picked up 5 of the 8 original fair information principles. So notice, choice, access, security, and enforcement. And just as an example of one of those, access is the principle that there should be no secret databases and you should be able to find information that is held about you. So you can go to any company that holds information about you and ask them, what is the record? And they will give you that record about yourself. And the online privacy policies are part of the concept of notice, that you should have notification of what information a company collects, how they use it, and what's going to happen with that data. So we're all fairly familiar with online privacy practices. If you look, this is just the bottom of the New York Times. On there, I'm sure you very quickly spotted the link to the privacy policy. So if you clicked on that, you would get information about what the New York Times collects about you and how they use that information. That's the idea. And the motivating problem behind all of this is called information asymmetry. And this is sort of an economics term, that if you have a company aware of what information they collect about you, but you don't know what they're collecting, then there's an asymmetry in what's known. And the classic example of this for a market failure is called a lemons market, where if you have a car owner knows if their car is fantastic or it's a lemon, but as a buyer, if you don't have that information about the car, you're not going to pay top dollar even if it's a fantastic car, because you just don't know as much about it. So there are ways that you can address that from a market perspective to give information so that you're able to have a more efficient market. And the FTC's solution on this was that there would be industry self-regulation rather than, say, congressional action or FTC action rather than laws, that industry would regulate itself. And the way that industry would regulate itself would be with these online privacy policies. So privacy policies, when they started, they were optional. That's still mostly the case today. There are some additional laws now. The content, the appearance, the structure, the whole framework for these online policies is in the hands of the companies. That's part of the self-regulation. It's up to the companies to determine how best to communicate the information to their customers. However, once companies post their policies, those are legally binding. And the FTC can bring a deceptive practices or a fraud action against a company that violates the promises they effectively make in their privacy policy as to what they will do and how they'll collect data. So this theory of industry self-regulation is that website owners will voluntarily post their privacy policies. If there are any problems with them, the FTC will bring enforcement actions. And then consumers will come along and they're going to read the online privacy policies for different websites. And they're going to compare them between websites. So for example, if they're purchasing something on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, they'll go read the privacy policy for Amazon and read the privacy policy for Barnes & Noble and decide which company they would prefer doing business with. And then they'll buy only from companies that have at least an acceptable level of privacy protections. And so what this does is it creates an implicit marketplace. We're back to this industry self-regulation, economics, marketplace concept. And so this marketplace will then efficiently reward the optimal level of privacy protections. So that's the theory behind all of this. And in practice, website owners have been posting their policies, sometimes with a little bit of coercion, but they are posting them. And the FTC is bringing actions when companies violate their practices that they've posted in their policies. Consumers are visiting new sites and buying from them, right? Study after study shows that people don't actually read the policies, let alone compare them and make buying decisions based on an implicit, perfect level of privacy. So that's the background on sort of how we got where we are today of industry self-regulation. And now I'll talk a little bit about the first study where we looked at the value of the time to read online privacy policies. So there's been this concept of, okay, well, we have this chain, but it's falling down because people aren't reading the privacy policies. And why might that be? And so the privacy community has responded by looking at better ways to build privacy policies, and we'll talk about some of those in the second half of the talk. And there's still this economics approach. So one was, well, instead of having an implicit market for privacy, what if we make it explicit? So you have a bundle of information about yourself, and you offer a lease to that information to a company for a set span of time. And Loudon was going to suggest that we do this on a national basis. That obviously hasn't happened. So why hasn't that happened either? Simpson-Garfinkel suggested that perhaps there's no zone of negotiation for a privacy market, which is if the seller and the buyer have no overlap between the prices that they'll accept, then there's no deal. So for example, if you would require $10 to sell your name and address, but right now the going rate is 7 cents, then there's no way there's going to be a deal there. So another concept that has been studied also, Alessandro Acquisti looked at the concept of intertemporal discounting, and what that is, to kind of put it a little bit glibly, is look shiny, right? People want things now, but the harms from privacy are diffuse and they're later. So people will tend to discount things that happen later in favor of things that happen now. So all of those are possibilities as to why people are less likely to read these privacy policies and maybe suggest ways we could go about getting them to read that. But I sort of stepped a little bit to the side from that stream and said, well, wait a second. Rather than trying to get people to read the privacy policies, let's look at what would happen if they actually did read them. So Carnegie Mellon is based in Pittsburgh. We are Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And I'm inviting you for the next few minutes to join me on his trolley as we go to, make-believe land here. We're going to have a wonderful time and look at what would happen if people actually did as the FTC envisioned and they read all of these policies. How much time would it take them to do that? And what would the value of their time be worth? So to estimate the time to read privacy policies, there's a little bit of math, but it never gets harder than multiplication. We're going to be fine. We're looking at this time to read, T sub r, which is the population, the number of all people who are online. And we need the average time it would take them to read one policy. And then we need the number of policies they read, how many websites they visit. So the population is estimated as about 221 million Americans, and this analysis is limited to Americans. We're looking at just a US-centric view. So to estimate the time to read one of the policies, that's going to be the average time to read a policy is going to be the number of words in that policy divided by the reading rate. So reading rate is pretty simple. That's 250 words per minute on average for high school educated people. That may actually be a little bit optimistic. It turns out that people read words on screen more slowly than print. And for a variety of factors, these are difficult texts to read. But then we have to figure out how long is the policy itself. So we went and measured the length of the 75 most visited websites, since that's where most people will go. There's the long tail on the internet. Most people visit these top 75 websites. And this gets us some estimate of the length of how long the policies most people would read if they were going to read policies would be. So if we look at this graph, across the bottom, that's the number of words in these popular privacy policies. And the blue bars are just a histogram, the frequency. So you can see that the most frequent, with a count of 12, is in the zone of 2,500 to 3,000 words. And then the red line is the cumulative percentage. So you can see that all 100% of the policies were under 8,500 words. And that about 50% on that line puts you up again around 2,500 words. So, okay, we have a low estimate for the number of words in a policy as just over 2,000, a medium estimate as about 2,500, and a high estimate of a little bit over 3,000. Divide all of those by 250 words per minute, and we have a range of times from about 8 to 12 minutes per policy, figuring that people would take about 10 minutes per policy if they were to sit there and read through word for word. So the third thing that we needed to estimate to put this all together was how many different sites Americans visit every year. And Nielsen has a nice estimate monthly on that, that if you look at how many sites people visit, they visit 185 unique sites every month. There is some overlap between the sites they visit at work and at home, which is how Nielsen collected this data. And so there are 14 sites, for example, Google, people might visit at work and at home, where people are going to be looking at them in both places. Now, it matters where people visit the sites when we get to estimating the value of their time, and I'll step through that at the end. But we do have this problem of how do we allocate that overlap of 14? So one way to do it is to say, okay, well, let's do a lower bound estimate. We're going to take all of those 14 and assume that they go into the home bucket, that every time somebody views Google, they view it from home for the first time and they read the privacy policy for Google at home. The other is we can take the middle and just sort of split the difference and say 7 of them are read at home, 7 of them are read at work, and then the last one for the upper bound estimate is to assume all 14 of them are viewed at work. So then we have a monthly estimate from that, but that doesn't get us an annual estimate yet. Now, a naive view would be just multiply by 12, but that doesn't work. People go back to the same sites again and again over time. However, we had also from Nielsen data a sense of persistence of which sites people visit on a weekly basis versus monthly basis. And so we were able to observe that overlap, and there's a scale factor there that ranges from about 2/3 to 3/4. And so we used that to estimate how many sites people read annually, and just multiplied that through to get a total estimate from about 1,300 to an upper range of about 1,500 unique sites people visit per year. So coming back to the beginning of why we were doing all of this, we have these 3 variables we're putting together. The 221 million Americans, that was the easy part. Estimating the time it takes to read for a policy by measuring the length and dividing by words per minute. And then this last estimate of how many unique sites people visit per year. So multiplying that through, for just individuals, we're looking at a medium estimate of about 244 hours per person per year. And you're yawning, which is fantastic. That is exactly what people would do if they had to read privacy policies for 244 hours per year. And a lower estimate there of about 181, an upper estimate of about 304 hours per year to read privacy policies. And if we multiply this through by the population of 221 million Americans, we're looking about 54 billion hours a year for United States internet users. But there's a question here, right? Who would sit down and actually read every single word in a privacy policy? Even if we're going with the FTC's model is that people should read policies, there's no reason to think that they would sit there and read every single word. What if instead we had them skim the policies and look for specific information that's responsive to the concerns that people have that they would try to use privacy policies to answer? That might be a more realistic approach. So this is still a little bit of Never Never Land here because people don't skim privacy policies on a regular basis, but perhaps a little bit more realism than reading every word. So to estimate the time to skim, 2 of the 3 variables stay the same. The population of internet users doesn't change, and the number of unique sites they visit every year doesn't change. We just need to know how long it would take to skim a policy. So for this, we performed an online study of 212 people, and we asked participants to find answers to questions about the practices that companies have. And these were based on a prior study of what people's concerns are reading privacy policies. And we asked them multiple choice questions so that the act of answering the questions wouldn't take them that long. And there were some pretty basic questions, like, does the website use cookies? There were also some that were a little bit more complicated. So we looked at 6 different policies that had different lengths. There was a very short policy to a very long policy, and then 4 of them clustered in the middle, right around that 2,500 word mark, where we know is about average for the policies we looked at. And to answer those questions, we had median times ranging from 18 to 26 minutes, substantially larger than the earlier estimate of about 10 minutes. So there's a problem with this, which is that you can manipulate the length of time by how many questions you ask. So that was a little bit uncomfortable. So we took a different approach, which was to look at the training question that we asked them. We asked them a warm-up question, and that question was, what is the business address for the company? And in all of those, we had it at the end. So they would look for that information. And for that, we had time estimates from 4 to 8 minutes from these 6 different policies. So this is a very conservative estimate. You can imagine that anyone who clicks on a privacy policy link is looking for more than just where are you located. But it at least doesn't have the problem that we can ask more questions and change the length of time. So for this, we had a low estimate of about 3.5 minutes, a medium estimate of just over 6 minutes, and a high estimate of about 11.5 minutes for time to skim through a privacy policy and just get the basic information. So again, multiplying this through again, the only thing that we've changed is this S, the time to skim policies, and it winds up with about 154 hours per year per person to skim privacy policies for all of the sites that they visit during the course of the year. And across the United States, it's about 34 billion hours. So now that we have some sense of how long this would take, what would the value of that time be worth in dollar figures? And there's some economics behind that, a fair amount of literature. Becker argued in 1965 that the opportunity cost for anything is also including the time as an implicit cost of goods, because you could be doing something else instead. So rather than getting my PhD, I could be on a beach in Maui right now, right? There has to be some value for the time that I'm spending on the PhD, and not just that I could be earning a salary instead of a stipend. So for economics literature, we found that time should be valued as salary plus overhead, which in the United States is twice the rate of salary. So that's the cost of the lights and the electricity for the computers and all sorts of other things in your office. And for leisure time, through some studies on revealed preferences and willingness to pay, other studies have shown that people value their leisure time at about a quarter of their take-home pay. So if we look at the value of time by location, we have 2 times wages for work and a quarter times wages for home, with a national average for just under $18 an hour. Brings us to a value of work time as about $36 and home a little less than $5 an hour. So multiplying that through again, the estimate for the amount of the money that it would be worth for your time if you were to read these policies, personally, it's about $2,200 to skim, $3,500 to read, and nationally we're looking at about just under $500 billion to skim and $781 billion to read as the middle estimates. So that's a lot of money. And to put this all in perspective, the time itself is greater than the amount of time people currently spend handling spam, and it's actually right on par with the amount of time people currently spend surfing the web. So we would ask people to spend as much time reading privacy policies as they do web surfing. And that value estimate, personally, is several times larger than the cost for broadband access every month. And that's been seen as one barrier to entry of getting people to come online. And the overall estimate was right about online with some of the early estimates for the stimulus. Stimulus has gone up since then. So if companies aren't able to make privacy policies more readable, then we have a problem. And one possibility is to look at regulation to change how disclosures are done. But if we just have regulation of give people more information, then we're actually possibly making the problem worse instead of better. So it's not quite as simple as just have a law of you must provide this information. So transparency is good, but it's not necessarily the only concern. Another question is this out of balance? A lot of people's privacy concerns stem from advertising. And the FTC has questioned whether consumers currently understand what information is being aggregated about them for advertising. The value of online advertising was estimated by the IAB to be about $21 billion in 2007. That's since gone up. But does it make sense for internet users to be asked to give up almost $500 billion of their collective time to protect themselves from a $21 billion industry? It seems a little bit out of whack. Now, obviously, online advertising has more value than just the ads, right? They're the goods sold, there are all sorts of other things that are part of that value chain. And for example, in direct mail, it's been found that it's an order of magnitude higher, all of the value that comes out of direct mail advertising. So that would mean, about $200 billion of value through the entire value chain. That's still a little bit out of whack. So the balance between the costs that are being put on internet users versus the overall benefits to targeted ads for industry may be currently misaligned. So that was paper 1. And paper 2 looks at standardized privacy policies. So there's a conflict between the legal liability companies have and the goal of notice and transparency. The less companies say, the less they can possibly be on the hook from the FTC for any sort of enforcement action. Meanwhile, from a customer perspective, privacy policies require a college reading level, and they have technical jargon, and they have legal terms, and so they're very difficult to wade through and understand. There have been also studies of textual ambiguity called weasel words. So for example, at Acme Bank, we care about your privacy. That's why we sell your information at every possible opportunity. Right? That's the sort of thing that you see in privacy policies. It's very confusing to people, and it's hard to reconcile the emotional tone to the content for people. Also, every single policy is different. They're like snowflakes. So people have to start from scratch when they pick up a new privacy policy and try to understand what's going on. Many people have documented that there's low readership. The estimates vary from 2% to 20% of the population read privacy policies. Yet, it's not as if people don't care. For example, there was a wonderful study Janice Tsai did looking to find that people actually will pay a premium for sites that are tagged as having better privacy practices when they go to purchase things online. And that was something they were doing with their own credit cards, their own money, their own data. And we've also seen some backlash when people have their expectations shattered. So the Facebook beacon backlash was probably a really good example of that. People do care about privacy, but they really don't want to read these online privacy policies. So can we reduce this burden of time that people would have to go through them, yet also improve their comprehension, which is a problem? And so one possibility of how to do this is standardized formats for privacy policies. So we could highlight the most important information. People don't have to start all over again every time they look at a privacy policy. And it would be a lot easier to compare between privacy policies if people wanted to do that. So I'll look at 3 different formats. Natural language, which is not standardized at all. It's what most websites have. Layered, and Privacy Finder, and I'll show you what those both look like before getting into more detail about them. So most of us have, at least at some point, seen an online privacy policy. It's a lot of text. You can see from the scroll bar up there, this goes on for quite a while. And it just explains how the company collects information and what they do with it. For a layered policy, the idea is to have a quick one-page summary. These teal boxes with the arrows pointing to them, those are standardized. Every layered policy is supposed to have a scope, personal information, uses, and 4 other headings. What appears within those categories is up to the authors, just as natural language is completely freeform up to the authors. But those boxes are fixed, and the idea is that this should only be 1 page. You can see the scroll bar is much shorter. The other thing that's required is all of these policies must have a link to the full-blown privacy policy for more information. And the third one I was talking about, this is much more standardized. This is the Privacy Finder report. And all of the information here, except this bit circled, is actually automatically generated from an XML representation of a privacy policy. This yellow bit that's circled, that's free-form text. And so that could be, many paragraphs. It could not be there at all. But all of the other bullet points and the ordering and the putting the most important things first, those come for free as part of the format that's designed for this. So to put the 2 standardized formats side by side. So the big idea for layered is it's a one-screen summary. And for Privacy Finder, it's a summary from P3P, which is an XML representation of privacy policies. And it's a bullet point, and it puts the most important information up at the top. The parts that are standardized differ. In layered, it's just the headings and the link to the policy that are standardized. And in Privacy Finder, the text itself is generated from the P3P behind it. So the inverse for the flexibility where the authors can change what they write. And then adoption has been different too. Layered was really picked up in the EU. There's Article 29 guidance, and several of the Fortune 500 companies in the United States have picked it up as well. And it was developed at Hutton & Williams, which is a US law firm. Privacy Finder is available for any company that has implemented P3P through the Privacy Finder search engine. And it was developed first at AT&T, and development now proceeds at CUPS at Carnegie Mellon. So for the research behind this, we looked at a few things. First, we wanted to see, do these standardized formats that people have been very excited about actually work? Are they an improvement? And the 3 areas we looked at to test whether their improvement were people's accuracy at answering questions, the time it takes them to answer questions, we want that to be low, and psychological acceptability. And we'll get to that at the very end, but the basic idea here is that people won't use what they hate. Most software engineers in the room are familiar with that as a concept, right? So the other question we looked at was how much variance is there in online privacy policies between e-commerce policies? Privacy researchers tend to talk about online policies as a block. Does that make sense? And so we looked at 6 different policies and deliberately set them to be pretty readable to pretty dreadful. So on the pretty readable side, we have text here that has bullet points, it has headings, it's fairly clear. On the worst side, it's one big block. It's really difficult to even know where to start. Like your eye just sort of skips over it. In terms of the text itself, we do not rent or sell our email lists. Okay, I know what that means. For the worst policy, moreover, the Acme family of companies will not share your email address with third parties for promotional purposes except when you consent to such sharing in the course of your participation in a sponsored activity as described below. Just once, I would love to say that in one breath. But even reading that, I still have no idea. What's a sponsored activity? That's capitalized. That has to mean something. As described below, okay, now I have to scroll down. And what's a promotional purpose? So it just leaves me with a lot of questions still. You can also see that, in the first line there, it says CA4 below. This particular policy sends people up and down the policy several times to figure out what's going on. So we can have sort of this sense on our own as researchers, having read a bunch of policies, of which ones are better or worse, but we can also add some metrics to that. And we looked at these 6 policies, the worst one on top, A, and the best one at the bottom, F. And if we just print out the policies, the worst one was 13 pages long. The best one was only 3 pages long. And there's also a standard metric of reading ease, and this applies across a wide variety of texts. And the idea here is that the greater the reading ease score, the easier it is to read something. What we found was that within this range, they all come up with what's known as difficult. Now, they span from the very bottom of difficult, a score of about 32. That's right about on par with Harvard Law Review. It's just not the sort of thing that you would generally read for fun. And then the one that's the best of the 6 that we looked at, that one is closer to Time Magazine. Not quite that easy to read, but at least closer. The other thing we looked at is the percentage of passive voice sentences. So passive voice, bringing you back to 7th grade, that's where instead of saying, I did X, X happened, right? We've heard politicians use this. Mistakes were made, not I made mistakes. So passive voice was one indication that we could look at that maybe people weren't being as transparent in their policies. It's not a guarantee. There's some people who just do this as a stylistic choice, but it was also interesting to see. And because that policy had so many, C section A4, we also looked at the number of cross-references. And you can see that the one that we found to be the worst policy really has a lot of cross-references. And by the time we get to the better policies, they're very few. So the last 2 things to note are the word count. So Privacy Finder had a very standardized format, but the amount of text people are providing in addition to that standardized format varies. So you can see the low here for policy D with 554 words. That's a policy where the authors did not choose to add any words at all. And then 4 times that much for policy C with 2,000 words. So there's some variety in there as well. For the natural language policies, the word counts map fairly closely to the page counts. They're not one-to-one, but they're close, as you'd expect. So the way we went about studying this was we used a between subjects design, and that just means that every person who participated in this study saw exactly one policy. They didn't see multiple policies. And then we asked them a series of questions about that one policy. And we tested the questions beforehand and pilot tested all of this. And this study was my winter of 2008. We recruited participants from blogs and Craigslist, and it was for a gift certificate drawing. And we had 15 conditions. We had the 6 different policies and the 3 different formats, which multiplies through to 18. 3 of the policies did not have layered formats. So we weren't testing the formats they didn't have. And we had about 750 people with about 50 people in each condition. So just to talk a little bit about the sample, we had people who were younger, better educated, and more confident with computers than internet users as a whole. So you can sort of think of this as another optimistic view. It probably doesn't get a lot better than this. We also had to remove some outliers. So because we were entering people in a drawing, we had people who weren't interested in answering the questions. They were just clicking through to put their name in the drawing. So we admitted people who were obviously too fast. And we also had people who were interrupted. They might take a day and a half to answer a question. Something had come up in real life. They didn't get back to it. So we kept their answers, but we omitted their times. For the questions, we started with that training question that I'd mentioned before of looking at a company's address. And the reason for that was we found in lab studies that sometimes people read through the entire policy and sometimes people don't. And we wanted to normalize for that before we got to the questions. And then we asked 4 questions. We asked if the website uses cookies, if there's a way to opt out of email marketing, and if the company will share your email address with another company. And then we also asked if the company is able to use your phone number for telemarketing. We also measured the response times people had to those 4 different questions. So for the first question, does the company use cookies? This had a very high accuracy, 91% overall of people who were able to answer this question correctly. And all policies in all formats mention cookies explicitly. So that made it a much easier question for people to answer. And in fact, in most cases, they didn't even need to know what cookies were. They could still figure out the answer was yes, even if you changed the word cookies to mumblefrog, right? They didn't need to understand. They just could still answer yes. However, the layered policies fared worse with a 78% accuracy overall. Now, looking at this graph, across the bottom, we have the 6 different policies, A through F, and then down the left side, we have the percentage answered correctly. And for these bars in blue, we have natural language, that's the unformatted text. In pink, we have privacy finder, which was very structured, and in red, layered, where the sections are structured, and there's a link to go back to more information. So we found for layered that it was worse, and part of that was these blocks with the standardized formats in layered. There's no standardized cookies header. But in a lot of the text policies, there was. There would be something that specifically said cookies, so people could skim through, find cookies, find the answer, and they'd be good to go. But in the layered policy for F, it was actually listed under personal information, which isn't where a lot of people would look for information for cookies. And in D, it says you may also turn off cookies in your browser. So you have to figure out from that that means cookies are being set. And every time people had to make some sort of inference, you'll see that again and again through this, the accuracy scores drop. So the times for this were also really good. These were the shortest times for anything we saw, with 2.3 minutes to answer this question on cookies overall. And there were no statistically significant differences between the mean values in companies, right? So yes, the different times were different, but it could have just been chance. But format, we did find statistically significant differences, and Privacy Finder and Layered were both a little bit faster than the natural language. However, the Layered had more incorrect answers, so that's not necessarily a good thing to be fast but wrong. So the second question was about finding a link to a web form to remove yourself from an email marketing list. We deliberately didn't say opt out to avoid having jargon in the question. There's a huge range on accuracy here. Natural language goes from 93% to 33%. And we were giving people 3 options. So 33% is equal to random chance. That's a really bad score. How did that happen? Well, it required finding a single link buried in 13 pages. It's kind of like an Easter egg hunt. So it was very difficult for people to find that link. Privacy Finder, we would expect a lot less variance, but there's actually still a fair amount here, from 91% to 51%. What's really intriguing, though, is that in Privacy Finder, we had 2 policies with the exact same policies here, right? They had the same practices, and yet we had a big difference in accuracy. And the difference was not from the Privacy Finder format, it was from the free-form text the policy authors added. And as if that weren't interesting enough, that free-form text was then copied and pasted into the layered policy. And there's a difference in accuracy there, too, from 92% to 79%. Accuracy actually went up in the layered policy. And it's likely that part of the reason for that was that layered was just shorter. So it was easier to find the information for people as an information search task. And finally, the range for layered policies was all over the map, from 92% accuracy to 18% accuracy. And if you look at the accuracy for B in particular, which was dreadful, it required people clicking a link to find out what the link did. It was not well labeled. You had no idea what page you would go to when you clicked it. It wasn't quite click here, but it was close to that. So people had a very difficult time knowing what was going to happen, and they didn't click the link to find out. So we look at the times for this, and what we would have expected would be sort of a very ordered curve, right? We would expect that the longest policies would have the longer times for things. Again, is this concept of an information search, but that's not what we found. It sort of wiggles all over the place. And instead, what the main factor was that when there was no link to find, people took longer to answer. They probably got to the bottom, didn't find it, and said, oh, well, I should go back again and look. But if they find it, they're done. They can, click their answer and move on. So the underlying policy had more effect than the length of the policy in this case. And we find that layered and privacy finder, again, are faster for people to answer the questions than natural language, and accuracy is all over the map for these. So the third question of 4 was to ask if the company can share your email address with another company that might put you on an email marketing list. So basically, will you get spam? And the overall accuracy rate here dropped to 60%. This, again, is one of those times where things required inferences. So as just an example for the natural language policy for B, it says, we may provide your contact information and other personal data to trusted third parties to provide information on products and services that may be of interest to you. Now, if you're reading that, you understand that, okay, contact information can include email address, and information on products and services that may be of interest to you, yep, that's going to be some sort of marketing. And trusted third parties, okay, that's a company other than this one. But it takes putting things together a little bit more carefully. And so people had a harder time answering questions like that. And we would have expected that the more readable policies would have higher accuracy scores. But again, we don't have a nice, clear pattern here. The data are all over the map. And there was no significance between the formats, no statistical significance. So yes, there are differences, but could just as easily be random chance. For the times for this, there were no significant differences for company or for format. We did see that overall the times to answer this question were much longer, at just over 5 minutes. So this was a more difficult question for people to answer. And the fourth and final question was, can this company use your phone number for telemarketing? So this question was really difficult for people, and sort of like a jigsaw puzzle. One of the policies states, the information you provide to Acme on certain Acme websites may also be used by Acme and selected third parties for marketing purposes. Plus, then, there's another section elsewhere in the policy that talks about phone numbers. So you have to put the information together from 2 different places to draw the inference that telemarketing is allowed. And that's a really difficult task for people to do. The accuracy for layered was down at 28%. Remember, random chance is 33%. Part of the problem is that the layered policies don't mention telemarketing on the first page. And what we found in lab studies is that people don't click the link to go to the full policy. So they see, oh, well, the information isn't here, and then they guess as to what the status is. And they have their impressions of whether the company is going to telemarket to them or not, and that's what they answer based upon rather than based upon the text. For privacy finder, that was the only format that actually requires some notice about telemarketing, because that's part of the P3P spec, the XML spec, that the privacy finder format is based upon. So for there is a statement yes or no for telemarketing. And privacy finder, in the pink, did much better for accuracy than the others, 61% overall versus natural language at 39%. And some of this, again, has to do with this jigsaw kind of approach that the natural language policies took. So for the timing, there were no significant differences for companies, only for formats. And the layered and privacy finder were both faster than natural language. But again, layered, the accuracy was dreadful. So for this one, privacy finder did better than the other two formats. So I said I'd come back to this concept of psychological acceptability. And we asked 8 different questions on a 7-point Likert scale. So, do you strongly agree, mildly agree, strongly disagree, with statements about how much they enjoyed the process of reading privacy policies. And at a high level, the results are in the paper. It didn't matter which format, it didn't matter which company, people don't like reading privacy policies a lot. The difference between these policies in many cases weren't significant. But when there were significant results, they tended to have small effect sizes. So that means you might have a statistically significant result between 2.1 and 2.2, but that 0.1 really isn't something you're going to write to the New York Times about as a result. It's just not a very important result. So people did like the layered better, and they did trust the privacy finder format a little bit more. But in general, when they didn't have these policies side by side to compare, remember, they only saw one policy, the results were amazingly similar between these. So to discuss this second paper, all of the formats we found to be unsatisfactory. There was low comprehension, especially for synthesis questions, and people dislike reading them. There was better readability, the better readability for natural language, the policies that we thought were the best, didn't actually improve comprehension. In some cases at all, and in some cases when they did, it was barely. We found a much larger variation between the standardized formats. Turns out that even when you have the same practices, you can get different results because there are these free-form text blocks. And the authors have a lot of leeway in what they present and how they present it, even with very standardized formats. The current standardized formats are not all that different from natural language. Privacy Finder was better for complexity, especially with the topic that was included in P3P. So if you could imagine being able to cover every topic anybody ever cares about, that's a great approach, but that's a difficult thing to do. And layered was faster. People were able to go through it more quickly, but because there's the link for more information, that actually hid information, and people wound up not understanding the content of the policy. It actually did harm. So the policy implications here are, before unveiling the next best format, test it first. We do not suggest regulation requiring standardized formats. They don't offer that much benefit, and in some cases can be worse. But standardization does remain a promising idea. We saw places where the standardization really did help people, and the more complicated it got, the more standardization helped. So perhaps different standardized policies would be better than the ones tested. And in fact, there's one that's being looked at right now in the CUPS lab, which is a nutrition label approach, and this is under testing right now. So, okay, we've talked about this sort of situation where nobody reads privacy policies, and if they do, they can't figure out what they say anyway. Now what do we do? And there are sort of a few different policy choices that are immediately obvious. One is we could do nothing at all. We could keep self-regulation but modify it somehow. We could move away from self-regulation, or we could have all of these approaches attempt to happen at once. So to just kind of go through, whatever your beliefs are, I will probably say something you don't like in the next 2 minutes. So for doing nothing, proponents on that say, well, we need more time for industry self-regulation to work. In particular, there's been a new approach for behavioral advertising that's come out of the NII and some other groups, and that hasn't even rolled out yet. So we need to see how well that works before we do anything. And other people say, well, there's no need for action at all. Privacy is bad. It separates people. It reduces community. That's one view that I've heard. The status quo is fine. Nobody has a problem with it. Just because they don't read the policies, fine. This FTC vision didn't happen, but so what? Another approach, the Scott McNeely view, privacy is dead, get over it. Why would we change anything? there's no problem. And the last one I heard was that all you have to do, you see, is just wait for old people to die. Because it's just old people who have to worry about privacy. So this is a cultural issue. The opponents to the do-nothing view counter that actually right now there is harm being caused, especially to people who are vulnerable. For example, people who have stalkers, people who have issues with oppressive governments. There's some real privacy harms right now. Being identified, especially by location, could be a real problem for some of those populations. Also, as mentioned before, the public does tend to get outraged, even those old people on Facebook. Self-regulation isn't working, as many studies have shown. Another argument came from Microsoft. They believe that they're losing potential customers on their Health Vault product, and that people are so concerned about privacy, but they won't read to see how more protective Microsoft is of their medical privacy. And so this is back to that lemons market concept at the beginning, that people don't understand that this actually is different. And so Microsoft thinks they would have more customers if things were better conveyed. And there's also the argument that privacy is a basic right, and so it deserves full protection and that doing nothing is not acceptable. So a second approach was to keep self-regulation but change it. And some proponents there say, well, companies are really innovative as soon as you threaten them with regulation. So all we have to do is keep banging the drum that there will be regulation, and companies will figure it out for themselves. And they'll be better at it than government would. There's an entire community on building privacy-enhancing technologies. So I've heard people talk about basically reinventing P3P, not knowing that it already exists. Reinventing privacy seals, not necessarily understanding privacy seals were a concept that you would have an outside group say, yes, this is good privacy, or no, this isn't. And from industry, there are opt-out cookies, so if you don't want to be tracked from a site, you can indicate that. Now, quite what those do in practice is a different story, and Taco is a very good attempt at making opt-out cookies permanent through a browser extension in Firefox. So another possibility would be for the FTC to publish sample policies. If we know that text can make things better or worse for people, well, let's go write some good text and make that available to everybody in one place. And sample policies have worked very well in other areas with similar issues. We could also mandate better formats rather than content. We don't seem to have solved that one yet, but maybe that will be solved. We could also redefine success and say, well, policies weren't really designed to be widely read. These are more of a legal document rather than providing notice and transparency, and so we don't have to change it too much. Some opponents to keeping self-regulation but tweaking it slightly view that, well, privacy protections shouldn't be a burden on the user. Instead, the user should be less encumbered and feel less concern online. Also, people mistakenly believe that the link for privacy policy at the bottom of a page means that they're protected by law. There's a wonderful study about that. So user expectations are violated when it turns out that they're not being protected. I would argue, having worked in documentation for many years in software companies, that we've actually effectively trained users out of clicking the privacy policy link. That they've found that they have a bad experience when they do that. So even if we improve what's behind it, it's going to be difficult for people to decide that now they want to go click the privacy link again. Better privacy policies may in fact be a necessary component, but not sufficient to cover this area. And then there's that view again of privacy as a right, that it's not a commodity, that we shouldn't even be looking at this from an economics framework in the first place. So the third big idea is to just try a completely different approach instead of industry self-regulation. And there's some legislation coming out of Congress for that right now. Regulation possibly from the FTC. They have basically said if industry can't get it together, we will become far more regulatory. The first rounds of this may not be terribly strong, much as some of the environmental protection laws were not very strong, but it's possible to then go back and make them stronger once the laws are on the book. It's a lot easier to amend them. And the right to anonymous speech is constitutionally protected. There's a now general opposition to the concept of industry self-regulation. Enron, banking collapse, it's kind of gone out of fashion a little bit. And another argument is that we've tried everything else already that we could do with industry self-regulation. Now, the opposing view on that is that getting the government involved is just never a good day. That government will only make this situation worse, whatever they do. That actually you run into constitutional issues around free speech, and that passing laws to limit how advertising works runs right into free speech protections. There are other arguments that the FTC does not have authority to do much more regulation than they are right now. That will have to be hashed out in court if the FTC steps up. Another argument is that there are quantifiable economic benefits to advertising and to the online ecosystem. There are quantifiable economic harms to limiting that, right? And the benefits to limiting it are uncertain. Somewhere, somebody might not have been stalked. That's a very difficult thing to really put your finger on how much value that should have. Another issue is that it's extraordinarily difficult to say, well, whose privacy level should we regulate to? Mine, yours, somebody else's? We probably have different views as to how much is enough privacy and how much is too much privacy. So where do we draw that line if we're writing laws that cover everybody? And the standard claims the internet is too young, industry is too strong, so we should take a different approach, even if we do want things to be different. And the last question was whether regulation would create a floor, which is everyone must be better than this regulation, or a ceiling, that there is now no incentive to do any better than minimal. But I think in real life what we have is all of these approaches coming together at once. It's sort of a great privacy scrum. It's a very political moment. So we have new regulation being proposed, there are industry associations involved, standards bodies, the privacy-enhancing technologies communities, privacy-reducing technologies at the same time, privacy principles like the fair information principles I talked about at the beginning, human rights treaties, the US is a signatory claiming that privacy is a human right, and a whole bunch of social changes, not just that old people will die off, but as we get used to using the internet. So all of these are happening all together at once. Thank you very much. If you have any really quick questions, I'd be happy to take them or talk to people offline afterward. Okay, thank you so much for coming.